As a proud regional Queenslander, I always say, I'm not a tree. I live in the regions because I want to live here, not because I can't live anywhere else. And I want to contribute to a viable and vibrant regional community. And I think that means that we need to really be across what's happening in our community and be prepared to create the community that we want to live in. And so the people piece of a smart community is really important to me.
Hi, Smart Community friends. Welcome back to the Smart Community Podcast. This month, we are highlighting smart regions with two fantastic guests. If you haven't yet listened to our interview with Tim Neale in the last episode, I definitely recommend listening to it after this one. In this episode, I have a wonderful chat with repeat guest and Queensland's Chief Entrepreneur, Julia Spicer. We first had Julia on the podcast way back in episode 152, which was in January of 2020 in the Before Times. Now, in this episode, Julia and I discuss what smart community means for her and what has changed for Queensland regions since January of 2020. We talk about the COVID experience and how it can teach us about what rural communities experience in prolonged drought and other parallel type experiences. Julia tells us about the generosity of spirit that she sees coming through in regional Queensland and what COVID has taught us in terms of regional and industry level resilience. Julia and I explore the role of technology and data when responding to crisis and the role of government in supporting people and businesses to modernise. We talk about the absolute necessity of internet connectivity and the challenges and opportunities for smart communities in regional areas. Julia then tells us about the project she's involved in as part of her role with the Office of the Chief Entrepreneur in Queensland, as well as the emerging trends of global workforce shortages and the need for sovereign capability in Australia to support supply chains and industries. We finish our chat discussing how everyone in Queensland can leverage the opportunity of the Brisbane 2032 Olympics, even if you think it doesn't apply to you. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Julia. How are you today?
Hello, Zoe. I'm very well. Lovely to see you.
It's so great to see you. It's been way too long. We'll get into that in a second, but let's go to you. Who are you? What are you passionate about? Tell us about your background.
Zoe. So, thank you for having me. I am coming to you today from Bigambul country at Gundawindi, which is where I call home now. I grew up in southwest Queensland, north of Roma, and certainly where you and I crossed paths at you were much younger than me, but anyway, I was young once. And so my background is working in community development and originally in the environmental space, working with land care and catchment groups. And in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, I guess that's moved into some of the regional economic development space. Very proudly, I have recently taken on the voluntary role with Queensland Government as Queensland's Chief Entrepreneur. I'm the 5th Chief and I'm the first regional chief. So I'm really excited to be able to do this role from Gundawindi. Certainly have spent a bit of time in Brisbane in the last couple of months. I started on the 1st of December 2022, but certainly excited to see how we can really showcase some of the exciting activity and work that's happening around the regions in Queensland.
Awesome. Thanks for giving us that little update. I didn't realize it was only December that you took up the role because I feel like I've been hearing everything about it and I'm like, oh my God, missed the boat. How long has she been in this role for? But wow, what's happening even since then? So amazing. Now, you've been on the podcast before. We were just having a bit of a look and it was in January of 2020. So, we hadn't even heard of this thing called COVID-19, or it might have just been people started talking about it because we would have recorded that at the end of 2019. So we're going to get into that in a minute around what has changed since then. but I'll go broad first because otherwise I'll forget. And tell us what a smart community means to you.
Oh, I love this question. And listening to your podcast, I love the variety of answers you always get to this. For me, there's a couple of bits. I guess one is around the people in the community, for starters. So as a proud regional Queenslander, I always say, I'm not a tree. I live in the regions because I want to live here, not because I can't live anywhere else. And I want to contribute to a viable and vibrant regional community. And I think that means that we need to really be across what's happening in our community and be prepared to, create the community that we want to live in. And so the people piece of a smart community is really important to me. And then the other part is, and we'll talk about this no doubt, is how are our communities changing? How are we in control of our destiny, for want of a better word? How do we make sure that we're proactively preparing our communities for the changes that are coming? And that might be around technology, that might be around infrastructure, that might be around, skills and services. But there's a piece around how do we contribute, and also how are we really making sure that our community is moving with the times that we're living in, knowing that they're happening, those times are changing more and more quickly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think from a regional perspective, as a regional gal myself, although I'm hanging out more and more in the city these days, but man, I love going back out to the regions again, and been trying to work out a way to get back out there too. I had a really great conversation with Tim Neale on the podcast. I don't know if you know Tim Neale. He's very cool. And I'm just like, when can I come out and visit the farm, please? And he said anytime. So I just got to work out how to get there.
As will I, Zoe, as will I. You are welcome here anytime.
Maybe we should, plan a road trip for sure. I used to be the area engineer for Gundawindi when I was working for government. So I did many a drive out to Gundawindi. But anyway, enough about me. I am keen. I was going to talk about, so the actual podcast we did last time was about resourcefulness and resilience in smart regions. That's what it was called. And I think it really sets a really nice, foundation for after we recorded this podcast and released it, what we actually went into, right? There's, on the podcast, we talked about natural disasters and that like social fabric and all those type of things as well. Obviously, then we got hit with a pandemic and, things shifted and changed for the regions in so many different ways. And obviously some have shifted back, some have stuck. It's just a really big question. What has happened? What has changed? Where have we, moved to since that January of 2020 when we last had this conversation?
Holy moly. So just a little chat for a morning conversation. You're right in that when we spoke, it was just on the cusp of, some of the biggest changes the whole world has ever seen, let alone regional areas. But maybe I can kind of talk through some of our experiences here and we can link that to maybe what we saw in other parts of Queensland, Australia, and, maybe what was happening at a global level. I'm always really mindful to preface what I'm about to say with the fact that I understand that COVID was devastating for so many families, individuals, communities, and particularly impacted some of our more populated areas. So I'm very mindful that, in Australia, Victoria, and particularly in Melbourne, they really had a much longer and were probably more personally impacted by COVID than some of the rest of us. But if we think about it from a regional perspective, if we look at how we can understand each other between the regions and the cities, actually COVID in some little way gave people a little bit of an insight into what it's like when your community is in a prolonged drought. You don't know when it's going to end. You don't know how it's going to impact you. You don't know what's going to happen as a result of it. You've got no control over it. So in some ways, the personal and the mental strain of COVID for all of us as Australians is in some ways can be compared with how communities feel and are impacted by drought. And so I say that not to compare, but just to help people understand what then we can learn when areas go into drought and it seems like it's not something that impacts us. Well, actually, we now maybe have a better way of understanding where people are dealing with things and what's going on. And interestingly, before COVID happened, a few of us were having conversations around how do we support people and hold people in rural communities when there's a drought, when there's a prolonged drought, when jobs are not when we're losing jobs, which means we're losing people and families out of a region and they don't come back when it rains, wouldn't it be good if we had some base payment that people could access that would hold them and all of the rest of it? And people were like, that sounds like a good idea, but we don't know how we do that. And then a little bit later, JobKeeper, JobStarter, all of the things started. And people were like, oh, that's a little bit like what we were talking about with the drought, which in some ways is really good, right? Because it means we can use that in other ways, if ever we need to. We have a mechanism now of looking at how do we make sure that people don't fall through the cracks during really traumatic experiences like COVID, like a drought, like whatever it might be. So I flag that as a way to start this conversation because I actually think it created the opportunity for actually the regions and the cities to really come together and for us to be smarter around how we did business, how we communicated. We all know what Zoom and Teams and Google Meets are now, so we actually can do business quite differently and we can engage quite differently now as a result of COVID having happened to all of us across the globe. So I really just kind of want to draw the links. The other thing that happened, which I want to really flag as I think one of the beautiful silver linings of COVID, is the generosity of spirit that happened across Australia. And let me talk specifically around Queensland because I know what happened, right? Our borders were closed. People weren't travelling overseas. People weren't having their holidays and spending their savings overseas that they might otherwise do. And so they spent it in the regions. So the people that we got to meet down the main street of Gundawindi who were from the Gold Coast or the Sunshine Coast or Brisbane or somewhere else, who were doing a road trip around southwest Queensland, who were stopping in Gundawindi to buy shoes and stopping in St. George to, buy outfits and stopping in Roma to do something else, was just remarkable. On a daily basis, we were meeting people in our communities who thought that they could and should come and spend some money in the regions. And if that was happening in southwest Queensland, I'm sure it was happening across the rest of the state, right? And it was amazing. Like, it was the best of our state coming together to do some of those things. And so in any sort of crisis or tragedy, we also see the best of humanity, right? And we see the best of humans. And I think we did see that in COVID as well. And I'm not taking away, as I said at the beginning, I know that there was a lot of heartache and, particularly some of the, the health services were drawn on more than any of the rest of us ever would have thought. But I just wanted to kind of share a couple of those quick insights and things that we got to see in our community as a result of COVID. I guess there's a couple of other things we saw from a trends perspective, but just to kind of start there with a couple of those things. I don't know, Zoe, if you saw that with some of your travel as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think drawing that parallel to a drought is a really interesting one that I hadn't really thought about too much myself, but it makes a lot of sense. And it just kind of that, it was a unique experience in the sense that it was global, but it wasn't a unique experience individuals have experienced similar and potentially worse in some cases, on a day-to-day basis, depending on through periods of their life or the seasons of the chapters of people's lives. So I think that's a really interesting one because it was, this big crisis on a global scale. But yeah, individuals have the breadth of that crisis at an individual level, I suppose, but it's that kind of generosity of spirit that you were talking about that comes from like that social fabric we were talking about earlier, coming together because we're all experiencing this together, the hashtag we're in this together, all those type of things. When you're going through it by yourself or just your community and people can't quite grasp what, a drought, for example, can, the devastation that causes, you're missing some of that social fabric. And so you potentially can be much more lonely, much more, devastating on an individual level. And so I think, and not to, I guess, again, prefacing with, we know like the devastation that COVID-19 caused and continues to cause, but just, I think, appreciating some of those learnings and drawing those parallels so then we can, again, build resilience as we move forward in this, I think is a really important one.
Well, and I think if we look at resilience at a regional and industry level, I think one of the opportunities that, again, comes from something like COVID happening is, as a nation, we kind of got to see where we're slightly vulnerable in terms of being able to access goods and services from our global, at a global level. So we realised actually What have we taken offshore? Where are we solely reliant on one supplier? And if we can not get that into the country, what does that actually mean for us? So I think, if we look forward now a few years from this, what this means, we're hearing the term around sovereign capability a lot more now. What does that look like in terms of how do we do business differently? What are the opportunities for us to create new products so that we're not so reliant? That's an exciting space to be in, right? That's an exciting space to look at, well, what can our manufacturing industries look like moving forward? What does it look like in terms of how we're going to continue to feed and clothe people if we can't always access fertilizers and chemicals that we need to be able to do that? So we're sort of maybe in a bit of still this valley of uncertainty, let's call it, but there's some awesome opportunities on the horizon for us now too, if we look at, what does the next decade look like for us, and how do we learn from some of the challenges that we've had at that industry and service capability perspective?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you're talking about the generosity of spirit. We see that during those natural disasters, and then we learn, and then we appreciate it at the time, or whatever the word is there. But we don't necessarily want those disasters to happen, right? But we do want to build that. We want to capture that resilience, and that we're not just coming together because there's a disaster, but we've learnt those skills and then realize how important it is. And I also often think about it from a well-being perspective. If you bring it to that individual again, it's like, rather than just, oh, I'm really stressed, so now I'm going to go and look after myself because I'm to the point where I'm burnt out. It's actually that maintenance period. So it's like, oh, even though I'm going to go to yoga because I know that it helps my mental health. I'm not in a crisis now, but I'm just maintaining that level of well-being, or whatever the case is. I often think about it like that as well.
100%. How do we, so the whole prevention's better than cure, right, is certainly one piece of it. And I mean, I think the other thing that, happened again through COVID out of necessity was that people were prepared to make decisions quickly. They were prepared to try things. Government departments came together really quickly and looked at, well, what do we need? How can we support? What's a grant? What's a subsidy? What's a whatever? We don't need to get everything perfect. We just need to make some things and we can fix it along the way. That was actually fabulous. That was amazing that people could come together and do that so quickly. How do we make some of that business as usual as well, right? How do we support and do some of that? So, I think there were a lot of really good examples, and your point around, how do we take some of this past the point of crisis when we're back into normal living is a really important one. And then I think that's one that, bosses, business leaders, whoever it might be, I think, we really play a part in setting that example as well as encouraging our teams and our people to do it.
And I think the role of technology and data in this was also huge. And again, like you said, didn't necessarily get it right all the time, but we had to make decisions quickly. We had to, shift and move and play and work out. And again, it's then being able to use those tools that we have available, the data that we have available, what data did we need? But also, even obviously people asking questions is an important one too. What are we doing with this data afterwards? All those type of things. I think there were some things that were good, some things that were bad, whatever. But it's actually then, being more aware as a community and asking those questions. I mean, a lot of time it was bloody information overload, and I was like, oh my God, what's happening? But yeah, getting people to ask questions and realize that, to be able to shift and change, you actually need that data at your fingertips, the information at your fingertips, both from an individual perspective and then at that macro level as well. When things are shifting so rapidly, that information layer is so key, and you need to use technology to help us do that. But then also realize that the channels that we just assume, I might have on my smartphone or whatever, not everyone has those. So you also then need to think about the language of the community, both from an actual language perspective as well, but those channels that need to go to the community as well. So in regional areas, if the internet isn't amazing or whatever. But then it also really highlighted to me that strong internet connection and a device to connect to it. It has to be a human right these days, because if you didn't have that, you just could not get the information you need to stay safe, to connect, all those type of things. And that, yeah, internet connectivity as a human right, I think really was strong for me. And I mean, obviously the regions have been talking about this again for years. And in some cases, I was very surprised because I was like, oh my God, how, like I used to have to record this is not a big issue, but I used to record my podcast, not on NBN, but on my phone because the NBN would go up and down. And so I couldn't actually record a podcast. Then during COVID, I don't know, something happened, something worked. And I was like, oh my God, how am I going to talk to people? But I think something came together and some decisions got made quickly. And then, that internet kind of worked for me. I was in Toowoomba, etc. But thinking about those things again, like you were talking about, decisions can be made quickly when there's something that we really think is important. And I don't think it necessarily just has to be a crisis, but it has to be something that we have all got on board with and said, this is a big deal and it needs to be solved or, addressed in a certain way. And I think that works from, awareness, focus, and then action. And I think the regions are, the first movers in a lot of this space, like for necessity, right? And innovation by necessity.
Yeah, and I think again, so definitely internet connection. I mean, I remember I was running webinars and things helping people to use Zoom. So we were doing that with some land care groups around the regions that had realised that they were going to have to take all of their meetings online. They would needed to take all of their board meetings online, and they had a difference of, there were some generational challenges, let me say, so that they needed to teach people how to use Zoom and how to unmute, and let's not put the cat filter on if you can never turn it off again. We saw all of the funny stories happen. But I mean, the other thing that happened was, in some circumstances, it made regional businesses understand that if they are going to be a resilient business, they need an online presence, right? So look at the work that Buy from the Bush did, that Grace did through the drought again, in terms of getting businesses online, the economic development that's created, the economic growth that's created for small rural businesses. COVID did the same in terms of getting people online, right? We cannot live in a world these days where somebody cannot find you unless they are in downtown Gundawindi or Roma or Toowoomba or whatever. So I think, it was really good to see the support there and funding there to help people get onto, setting up a website page, being able to work out how to, have people buy their goods and services online. I think that was a really important space to, we needed businesses to get there. COVID in some ways helped them get there much more quickly, but the support was there financially to also do it because, again, moving forward, the world is a global shopping cart, right? We need to be able to be in that space. That's probably a bit harder if you're the tyre shop in Gundawindi, but for lots of other businesses, they needed an online presence and they had been avoiding it for whatever reason. COVID certainly got them there a lot quicker. So I think, there's some opportunities to move people into a much more modern business platform and space as well. How do the businesses use their data now? How are they using that to look at, from a business resilience perspective, how do they get some ideas now around, what are their products or services that are the most profitable? What are the ones that sell the best? Where are they selling to? And how do they then use that to determine where they market? I think there's still certainly some work for some of that to occur so that if they are trying to grow their business, they're using the data that they've collected now in a really clever way to identify what that looks like. And again, that's a skill set that probably a lot of us don't have. So it's how can we connect small businesses and startups with the sort of, with the people that are good at being able to help us not only see how we can use our data, but use it to make decisions in the business. I think there's a really, that'll be the next space, I think, for some of this, for some of the businesses to look at.
Yeah, totally. And I think obviously talk about smart communities, it's not just for local governments and state governments and, other agencies. It's the tools and the methodology and the process and the thinking and the mindset behind it helps, the smallest of businesses and the largest, because again, it's about knowing what tools are in your belt and knowing how to use them and then picking the ones that, you need at that certain time. And for me, it's, that real mindset shift that we can do things differently, that it's not all, set and forget, okay, cool, I'll live my life, someone else will make the decisions for us. And we know in regional areas that you can't do that, right? You can't just wait well, you can, but, it's not the future that you want, right?
Well, I also think the other thing for me that came up, and it's not my area, but me, can and will throw an opinion around, is this space of actually how do the regions work together from a tourism perspective. And so if we bring in the local councils and we think about, 2023 is a year of accessible tourism in Queensland, we think about the fact that we've got the Olympics that'll be here in, less than a decade now. How are there opportunities for us to work together to create really great experiences for people where it's not competing, Gundawindi's not competing with St. George for tourists. We're actually working together. Come to Gundawindi and do this activity, then go on to St. George and do this, and actually looking at what that means in terms of creating experiences, creating packages, creating opportunities. The Northern Territory and Northern Western Australia is known for its awesome First Nations sites, for Indigenous culture, for the beautiful artwork, as it rightly should. Equally, that's all over Queensland, right? How do we actually engage and help and support and grow so that when we do get overseas tourists coming back again and that they're more and more coming back to Australia, how do we do it where they don't actually have to go to the middle of the Northern Territory to have a really beautiful and strong Indigenous experience? They can do that in Gundawindi. They can do that in the Bunya Mountains. They can do that at Cunnamulla, So I actually think in terms of how we can connect and how we can really create, again, some of that community piece. How are we looking at, where people are travelling and moving? How do we get local councils to work together around some of this tourism space so that we're actually really, creating that, we're creating the connections and we're creating this impactful regional tourism opportunity that is genuinely accessible to everybody.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like that smart region approach, it's something we talked about last time on the podcast as well. And I guess you think about it from a tourism perspective, but then that same model methodology then can expand into other things as well. And businesses, supply chain, all those type of things. So I think that's really key. And, getting people to experience regional Queensland, regional areas. And then, maybe they do decide, oh, well, actually, yeah, I could live here. The cost of living is lower, but I can still do my job remotely, and maybe I travel every now and then, whatever the case is. There's a lot of opportunity for that as well.
Correct. Which means there's also then a lot of opportunity to look at how we can work in this housing space, right? So whilst all of the regions want more people, we actually don't have a lot of houses for them to live in at the moment. So what does that look, that for me, from a smart community, that creates so much opportunity. How are we building more resilient homes? How are we making sure that we're considering climate, the impact of climate? How are we considering green architecture? How are we making our homes smarter? What does that look like? I think that is the other thing for me in the next few years. I think we know we need homes, but let's not build them for this problem that we've got today. Let's make sure that we're building homes and infrastructure for what we need over the next 20 years.
Yeah, and along with that, the transport options with that, and the land use and those type of things, okay, let's not just, build sprawling suburbs where there's no footpaths, but actually thinking about walking, cycling, different types of public transport. You have to think differently when you don't have that density.
Correct.
But it's not impossible. And I think, starting to focus on those things and really set up models for the future is really, really important. And using the tech and data at our fingertips to be able to do such a thing as well.
Yeah, agreed.
Looking at the time. What a time. What a time it's been. Okay. Now, there's still a lot to cover. I want to go to the future, but is there anything else you want to share in terms of projects, exciting things happening before we go to the future?
Well, I could talk with you all day, Zoe, but I think probably we've covered a few bits and pieces. I guess if we've got people who are listening, particularly Queensland-based people who are listening, it would be really great to be able to connect with them through the office of the Queensland Chief Entrepreneur, if I can just do a quick little plug for that. So we've got some areas over the next 18 months that we're really wanting to focus on in terms of the programs that we deliver ourselves, the events that we might partner with people on, and the activity we want to be able to help leverage from the innovation community. And this is across Queensland, right? This is not just for the regions, but we're really looking at, there's a whole lot of transition that's happening at the moment, and how can we be helping people with that transition around into new industries. There's the jobs and energy plan is going to provide awesome opportunities. There's a whole lot of work happening. So how do we make sure that our innovation ecosystem has a role along the supply chain with that? We want to make sure we can be connecting people. So, who do you need to be able to do what you're doing? What support do you need? That kind of thing. And the other is, for me, is really around this piece of impact. So startups, scale-ups, unicorns are really important to our economy. So are social enterprises. So are businesses that want to scale at a sustainable rate and really continue to do good in their communities. And so they're the sorts of conversations that we want to be having. So if people are keen to be part of them, find us on all of the socials.
Yes. I'm really excited to see what kind of comes about in the next year. I'm excited to have a regional chief entrepreneur. So congrats on that. It's going to be amazing. And I know all the great work that your predecessors have done as well, and just kind of build it, but also shifting and changing it because you can make it your own, right? Yeah, I'm excited. I'm really, really keen. Now let's go to the future then, and let's talk about what are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough. I mean, I think we've already talked about some of them, but yeah, what do you reckon?
Yeah, we maybe have talked about them, but let's kind of summarize them again. So emerging trends, I think we're going to hear more, and we need to look more about this sovereign capability. So how can we continue to look after ourselves? We are an island and COVID helped identify some of the challenges there. So again, what's the innovation opportunity around supply chain? What does that mean in terms of new industries? And that might be new ways of growing food, or it might be whole new industries. But I think we're going to continue to see some more work happen around that space with the lens of sustainability, with the lens of impact to climate, with the lens of, technology and data. So I think that's going to be this holistic way of looking at things, I think is going to be really important, and we're going to see some more of that. I think I'm excited to see what Australia or Queensland, let me talk about Queensland. I'm really excited to see what Queensland really wants to be known for, and where we can really own a space, I guess. Is it going to be agri-food and ag tech? Is it going to be climate tech and renewables? What is it that we want to really be able to show to the world how a region like Queensland can really deliver on some of the challenges that we're all seeing? And I still think we're going to be dealing, the trend of there being a global shortage of workforce is going to continue. So what are some innovative ways in which we can tackle that? I think is still going to be something that we're going to see a lot of in the next, at least in the next couple of years. But with any of those challenges, I think there's lots of opportunity, and I think there's a way that Australia and Queenslanders, we're going to find our own unique way of dealing with that. That will be very place-based, and I think that's going to be the thing we kind of will be able to do well.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be an interesting time, and like you mentioned earlier, in Queensland, and particularly that's where we are. It's where your focus is at the moment. How do we leverage those big opportunities that are coming our way? So for the Olympics, for example, how do we do that really differently to be sustainable, but also really leverage, or what's the word, just like exploit the opportunities in regional areas leverage that opportunity in regional areas. I'll get it right one day. Just thinking about really, and we need to start yesterday, right? It seems a while in the future sometime, but these are the conversations that need to happen now. And I often talk about, when we think about big infrastructure projects and things, how do you get into the planning to embed some of this, maybe it's smart technology, that type of thing, but also the community values and, connections for, if I'm thinking about a transport project, there's last and mile connections that, people may not be thinking about, but again, that's shifting that mindset to kind of go, oh, like, obviously we need to get this big project happening, but then at the end, when you get off at the end, what other things do we need to connect in back into our communities, and how can that be done differently? I think there's massive opportunity at the moment, and it is a really exciting time to be moving forward in this space.
And I think part of that, so two quick things. I think there's a tremendous amount of work being done to look at how these Olympics can be really successful across a multitude of ways. And I think, we've got a legacy committee. There's people doing a lot of work within a range of different government departments around making sure, they can learn from previous Olympics. We can, be really clear around what that's going to look like. So I think there's some stuff happening there. I think the other bit though too is sometimes what happens is a business goes, if, Julia goes, Olympics, I am not known for my athletic or sporting ability. The Olympics have got nothing to do with me. And we take ourselves out of the game too early, quite literally, to see that there's any way that we could link with an event like that. And that would be a mistake for a lot of us. There's ag industries need to be talking about how we're going to do this. It's not just the period of time for the Olympics. What's happening after the Olympics? What's the business that gets done? So I think what I hope is over the next decade, what starts to happen is people realise that actually there's probably not any business in Queensland that can't capitalise on the Olympics occurring, in 2032. And so it's about thinking differently about where your business or community group or social enterprise actually fits in, because if we only see it as a sporting event, we've missed a massive opportunity. And I think that'll be the thing to really, it's easy for people to say, oh, it's happening in Brisbane, it's not going to impact me in Quilpie or Normanton or Julia Creek. Well, that's probably a missed opportunity, and we need to challenge a bit of that and, provide some ideas of where those businesses and entities might fit.
Yeah, I totally agree. Julia, it's been so great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much. We'll meet in 3D soon.
Please.
Let's get that in the calendar. But yeah, thanks again for coming on the podcast. You told us a little bit about the Chief Entrepreneur and where people can connect with you. But where else can people connect with you?
So I, from a day job, Julia, Engage and Create Consulting is still always the best. So our Facebook page, Instagram, I think on Instagram we're just at Engage and Create, no consulting. But Facebook, and you'll find me on LinkedIn, Julia Spicer, OAM.
I know. Congratulations. I meant to bring that up earlier. Massive congrats. Yeah. I mean, obviously well-deserved, not surprising, but just always amazing to be recognised in that space, yeah.
It was pretty amazing. Thank you. Zoe, thanks for all your work too. I'm always happy to have a conversation with you on the podcast if it's useful, but I really, we have some of our communities at the stage and space that they're at because they have been able to work with you, have you come and, do projects with them. So thanks and congratulations on all your work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I was thinking about, reflecting our podcast birthday is very soon, although this episode might go out after it, but it's 23rd of February. So, it's been a week of reflection because I have to record an episode. Well, I don't have to. I want to record an episode. And so, it's a good week of reflection, which I'll have to take the weekend to, think about where we've come from and then, where we're heading as well. So thank you. I always get massive energy, talking to people like yourself, and thank you. I love it.
Pleasure, Zoe.
Have a great Friday. I think that's all. I've asked you all the questions. We'll say goodbye. Thanks, Julia.
Bye, Zoe. Thanks.
Bye.
The Smart Community podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're trying to deal with disruption, not sure what technologies to buy, need to facilitate genuine collaboration, then we can help. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community/consulting.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter at SmartCommHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.